Eric Jensen, y para mí es un gran honor poder tener la posibilidad de presentarme a Eric. Eric es un profesor de la Universidad de Warwick en Inglaterra y originalmente su formación fue hecha en Estados Unidos. Es American citizen, pero trabaja en Inglaterra y es una persona altamente productiva. Es, la verdad, pocas las veces que yo al menos personalmente he tenido la posibilidad de presentar a una persona tan productiva, con artículos en Science, con publicaciones en Cambridge University Press y además mucho más joven que yo. No solo eso, sino que Eric es una persona que de una manera bastante generosa quiso aprovechar una invitación que hizo el programa Explora de Coloquios, que su especialización es sociólogo de formación y su área específica es la comunicación de la ciencia, la difusión de la ciencia, y en ese contexto ha sido invitado al programa Explora de CONICET. La próxima semana puede tener un encuentro en Punta Arenas y en ese contexto Eric de una manera muy generosa se ofreció y puso a su disposición su tiempo para poder estar acá con nosotros en la universidad, cosa que yo personalmente agradezco. Aprovecho de que él comprende bastante bien el español, probablemente va a querer presentarle en inglés, pero ustedes pueden evidentemente hablar en español si es que no va más. Y nada más que decir, agradecerle la presencia y ciertamente agradecer a Eric su posición de presentarnos esta investigación.
Muchas gracias. It's okay if I present in English. Is there, maybe we should make sure, ¿todo puede entender inglés? ¿Está bien? Muy bien. Entonces, no lo digo, sí. Okay. Okay, so I do research that's quite interdisciplinary. So my background is a mix of social sciences, communication for my undergraduate and my first master's. I even did a minor in psychology, so I'm quite interdisciplinary, and I kind of consider myself a social scientist more than specifically a sociologist or anything like that. So that may be evident when you see the research I'm going to present here, because this is not traditional sociological research. It is more the kind of research you would probably see around education. So this kind of area of my research is focused on trying to understand what is the effect of coming into contact with expert knowledge in different kinds of contexts. The thing that I'm particularly interested in is how lay publics, when they encounter unfamiliar ideas, what do they do when they try to make sense of these unfamiliar ideas. So I've done this kind of research in a lot of different settings, including science festivals, science museums, as well as non-science related places like National Gallery in London and cultural and literature festivals. So in all of these cases, my core interest is in how knowledge interacts with the general public. And so the research I'm going to talk about today is one example of this kind of area of research. I've become quite interested in zoos as a site for this kind of engagement. It's a particularly complicated setting where you have both human and non-human actors involved, as well as a kind of interesting history with zoos, where in the past zoos were quite heavily involved in doing very bad things with animals, where they would kill mother elephants in order to take the babies and off to zoos in Europe, for example, This is the kind of early history of zoos, but they have tried to rehabilitate their image in recent years. And they now present themselves as conservation organizations, that they're all about saving animals from extinction. And so I think this is an interesting kind of backdrop for research and looking at how effective their efforts are to try to get people interested in biodiversity and wildlife conservation. So this is the context. Another part of the context is that there is a kind of general recognition that there needs to be more engagement with biodiversity. Biodiversidad es muy importante, and the World Zoo Association is signed up as an official partner in the UN Decade of Biodiversity, which is an initiative designed to try to improve the situation for wildlife. I don't know whether you're familiar with this fact, but we're in the midst of a major extinction crisis around the world. I think it's considered the 6th extinction crisis, where there are massive numbers of animal species going extinct at a level that's not unprecedented, but it's kind of as part of the list, it would be the asteroid that hit the Earth, and then a number of these kinds of incidents, and this is the 6th kind of major incident, is humans ripping up the environment and animal species going extinct. So this particular crisis is made by humans, and so that makes it a particularly interesting one, I think, for social scientists. And one of the things that has kind of surprised me as I've entered this field over the last few years is that most of the work going into trying to do something about saving wildlife from extinction, most of that work is done by biologists. So they are looking at the problem as a kind of scientific problem, that they need to breed more animals, they need to do things that are purely in the kind of biological sciences, when actually the problems stem from social structures, from the fact that we have unsustainable consumer cultures that are resulting in all kinds of problems. The kind of food that we eat is unsustainable given the number of people, etc. So there are essentially social issues that are playing out in terms of wildlife extinctions. Anyway, that's part of the background. And then this specific initiative by the United Nations to try to address this problem includes as its first goal, right here, by 2020 at the latest, people around the world are aware of the values of biodiversity and the steps they can take to conserve and use it sustainably. So this is the first goal, and this is one of the things that the zoos and aquariums around the world have officially signed up to try to help deliver against this goal. So that's an important part of the current context. Another part of the context is that zoos and aquariums are a remarkably ubiquitous institution around the world. If you go around the world, you will see relatively similar zoos everywhere. And they're kind of embedded part of people's childhoods, of their experience worldwide. And so there are at least 700 million visits to zoos and aquariums around the world. That's actually just the kind of accredited ones that are members of the major organizations. So it's certainly higher than that. And all of those zoos and aquariums are officially committed to this goal of trying to promote understanding of biodiversity and to try to persuade people to behave more sustainably. So that leads into the research question that my research focuses on in this area, which is what difference does it make going to a zoo, if any? Does it matter if people go to a zoo? Does that have any kind of effect on how they think about biodiversity, whether they think it's important to protect biodiversity? So that's the kind of core research question. And it's a form of impact evaluation. First and foremost, looking at learning, and so that's the study I'm going to to talk about now. It's the kind of main quantitative part of the study was published in the journal Conservation Biology, which is one of the main conservation journals. And so that's the part I'm going to talk about today. And these were my research questions. Essentially, I was looking at a program at London Zoo, which has hundreds of thousands of children going through it every year. The context for the research was that the City of London was paying for children at state schools to go to the zoo on the assumption that it was doing something useful for them. And at a certain point, they wanted to check whether it was actually doing something useful for them. And so the Greater London Authority, the London City Government, commissioned me to do some research to evaluate what the effects of these visits were. So in particular, it was focusing on children and adolescents in school who were going to London Zoo. And the goal was to go beyond this kind of surface level, which is where a lot of practitioners stay, is like, look how excited they are, look how those smiling faces, it must be having a positive impact. It must all be going great. And so my research was intended to go beyond that to actually see how the children were processing the experience and making sense of it, that kind of thing, and whether it was achieving anything useful. But the methods I used were relatively open because I thought the existing research in this area was quite poor quality, and I didn't trust it enough to rely on it to design quantitative measures. So I used qualitative measures to try to figure out what were the range of things that were going on. And my research question was how and why is learning taking place within the zoo? And learning, of course, can be learning things that are both beneficial or things that are negative. So I had an open view of what kind of outcomes might be emerging from visiting a zoo. And in particular, London Zoo was particularly interested in whether, so there were basically two kinds of visits to the zoo. One is where a class arrives with their teachers and they go around and see the zoo. And the other is class arrives with teachers, with their teacher, and they first have a presentation from a member of staff at the zoo, who talks to them about the connection between wildlife and their wild habitats and this kind of thing. And then they continue on their zoo visit with the teacher. And so they were particularly interested in whether this made any difference, having this extra bit of education from the zoos themselves. So the condition, there are two conditions. The condition where they were only going around with their teacher I refer to as self-guided, and then the other condition is kind of zoo-guided. I did a whole series of studies. This was a 2-year project, and during it I did some initial open surveys, some pilot testing to design the survey I used in this main study. Did this kind of big study with over 3,000 children, and then followed it up with further qualitative research, focus groups, and ethnography to understand the experience better. So I'm going to spend the most time on this main large-scale survey study. So in this one, the sample was children aged 7 to 15, and it was a repeated measures design, so pre-visit and post-visit. When the schools booked in to go, they were sent a packet of questionnaires for the teachers to hand out with instructions for the teachers to read out a statement, and then give them 5 minutes to complete. And same thing the day after the visit to get the pre and post. And then a range of different measures were used, and it was quite a large sample size. For any student to remain in the sample, I needed both pre and post-visit data for them. So if for whatever reason I only had one or the other, I tossed out that data. And this is what the survey forms looked like. So the main outcome measure that I used down the bottom here was an annotated drawing. So I asked them to, it asked them to please draw your favorite wildlife habitat and all the plants and animals that live there, please put names or labels on everything. And then at the bottom it asks, what did you draw above? And those, the annotations were really important for understanding what they thought they were drawing and making sense of. But the other really important point is that the analysis was idiographic, so we only analyzed within individual for deciding what kinds of changes had occurred. So that controlled for the potential confounding variable of artistic ability, which obviously varies considerably. And I went for this drawing method in part because London is a very diverse, ethnically diverse place. There are a lot of immigrants and a lot of people who don't speak English very well. And so the children as well had quite a mix of backgrounds and linguistic abilities. And so using drawings was a way to get an impact measure that didn't rely heavily on their ability to articulate their experience in words. And then there's also a thought listing measure at the top there, which asks, what do you think of when you think of the zoo? Before and after, to measure that as well. Now the main kind of measure for whether impact had occurred, whether there was any change, was relatively straightforward. In this particular study, there was a scale of only 3 points. Positive change, no change, approximately no change, or negative change. And in subsequent studies, I've used a more sophisticated scale. It's 5 points or 10 points to kind of differentiate more carefully, but in this case it was just an overall judgment. And this is how that judgment was done. So we went from, there were 3 criteria used to decide whether there had been positive or negative change in the drawings within an individual. One was whether there was any evidence of increased conceptual sophistication. So I don't know if you can see from there, but it says sand in the first one and desert in the second one. So that's evidence of increased conceptual sophistication because they're going from the concrete experience of sand, the abstract concept of desert, which is a kind of habitat. And then another was the physiological representation of the animal, whether that had improved. And again, in this example, it clearly has improved. It's a more accurate drawing of the camel. The nose is more accurate. And there's also evidence of increased knowledge about the physiology of the animal, grasa y agua in the hump. So it improved on both of those. And then the third factor isn't relevant on this one, but it was actually the most important factor, which is their ability to correctly place the animal in the right kind of habitat. So in this case, they did it correctly in both cases. They put the animal in a habitat in both cases. So that wasn't at issue here, but in others that was the deciding factor because that was the judgment was that was the most important thing in terms of conservation. It's very important to understand that animals are adapted to a particular kind of habitat, and so if you want to save the animals, you have to save this particular habitat that they're adapted to. So this one would be designated a 3. This procedure was repeated over 3,000 times for all the children in the sample, and then a percentage of those were analyzed blind by a second analyst, me, and then compared to make sure that the level of inter-rater reliability was sufficient. This is standard procedure in content analysis. So the results showed statistically significant increases in learning from pre to post visit across the entire sample of children who were visiting. But in particular, those cases where the children had an additional presentation from the zoo, the increase almost doubled the increase in learning. So this showed, well, it could have showed, you could interpret this in one of 2 ways. One is that the zoo educational staff are doing a particularly good job of supplementing and providing conceptual resources, or that the teachers were doing a particularly bad job of supporting the visit from an educational perspective. So my follow-up studies investigated that point, and it was the latter explanation: the teachers were doing a bad job. And the thought listing measure, where they listed things that came to mind, also showed a significant increase in words related to conservation, which was further evidence that, on the whole, overall, children were better off, although there were a number of cases of negative impact as well. Another finding was that there was a broader range of species that were appreciated after the visit. So in the drawings that children did before the visits, they were much more likely to draw the kind of famous, charismatic animals like polar bears, tigers, lions, things like that. And they were more likely to include a broader range of species like bichos, después de dictada. So there was also much more mention of this kind of broader range of animals. Por ejemplo, bichos y aves, después de dictada. And so this is an example of the kind of shift from polar bear beforehand, this is the same child, polar bear beforehand, to Charlie the cockroach. Charlie the cucaracha, después de dictada. And in particular, Charlie here has a story which is that during a number of the educational presentations that they do, actually not just in London Zoo, but in zoos in general, they use a particularly large cockroach called a Madagascan hissing cockroach. And they take it around, they show the children, and the children can touch it and stroke it. And as long as they didn't have a teacher who freaked out and ran out of the room, which did happen sometimes, and that did not help, but as long as everybody was relaxed about it, that actually was very beneficial for the children appreciating a broader range of animals. And the zoo educators talk about the fact that insects are very important for the overall ecosystem. But that kind of affective experience of touching the animal makes quite a big difference. So these are just a few more examples of kind of pre-post transformation. So same child, jaguar. This was from the pilot testing where we were trying out the method. And so we gave them specific animals to ask them to represent relating to the topic of the zoo presentation. This is a sloth before and after, same child. Oh yeah, so the sloth is saying, "I'm not going down," which shows the child understood the message that the sloth stays up in the tree all the time, even to defecate, which was a point made in the presentation. So another finding that is significant in terms of the practices of zoos and how they think about how they engage with the public that come there. Some zoos that I've encountered have a kind of notion that if they put up too much kind of informational signage or they provide too many informational presentations, that they'll damage people's experience, that people want to just kind of wander around unguided, and that will be the best way to do things. It's a kind of naive notion in my opinion, and this study suggested that it's the wrong way to go, because actually the children who, out of their day, they both had the same amount of time, but the children with the zoo educational presentations, these were not in a kind of fun setting, like in the middle of an enclosure or something. These were in a classroom. So they had part of their zoo visit, 45 minutes in a classroom, learning information instead of being out in the zoo. And yet, they were more likely to indicate the highest level of satisfaction with the experience. So I think this makes sense because I think you enjoy an experience more when you have some kinds of conceptual resources to draw upon to make sense of that experience. But it was surprising for some of the people who work in this area. And the overall point was that there needs to be more and better interventions from the zoo for the broader experience. Clearly, if results could be a lot better for teacher-guided visits, parent-guided visits, visits probably could be enhanced even further if there was better kinds of conceptual resources provided to enhance the experience. So the kind of implications of the research suggest there should be greater intervention, and they kind of supported the Vygotskian model of learning, in my opinion. And in particular, this last point, the connection between the concrete experience of seeing animals in a zoo setting and then trying to imagine those animals in a faraway place in their wild habitat is quite an imaginative leap, and it's something that's not easy to do without some kind of support, some kind of scaffolding. And so that's something that particularly benefited from having the intervention from the specialist educators in that area. And I think that's the thing that's particularly important in terms of connecting learning to some kind of broader benefit for biodiversity and conservation. So I also did a follow-up study, a few different kinds of follow-up studies. One of them was using similar methodology and following up with the same students 6 to 9 months later. I did this research with Brady Wagner, a psychology professor at University of Aalborg. And we found that there was a drop-off in learning 6 to 9 months later. So we found that overall they were better off than before their visit to the zoo, but not as strong as immediately after the visit, which makes sense in terms of how memory works. But that was interesting to know. And then the follow-up studies, looking at the kind of qualitative follow-ups. Mainly what I was interested in knowing is why were the teacher-guided visits, the ones that were only teachers, why were they yielding lower levels of learning impacts and higher levels of negative impact than those that had two educators. They were still better off after the visit than before, but it was a much messier picture than when they had the extra support. So, yeah. So in one of the follow-up studies, I went around with the school children, and I asked them some questions during their visits about what they were seeing and what kind of sense they were making of it. Also what they were thinking about it, but also what were they feeling about what they were seeing. So this quotation summarizes what I found when children did not receive support, they didn't receive any kind of scaffolding, how they were able to make sense of the experience in a way that would be considered positive for biodiversity understanding. So this child said, I just find it fascinating all the different types of animals. There are different birds, like different types of birds, hundreds of them. I wouldn't have known about that. So this kind of observation that there are many different kinds of species, many more than they knew beforehand in their world of squirrels and geese and ducks, which is the British context for wildlife. So that is a very positive impact in terms of increasing children's understanding of biodiversity, but it's quite limited. But this is possible without support. Without support, though, it was also much more likely that you'd see learning going in a kind of unhelpful direction. So here's an example. I was interviewing the child, and she was telling me about seeing a Galapagos tortoise, very large, muy grande tortuga. And she said, I've never seen a turtle bigger than my hand before. So you're surprised at how big it was? Yes, it was moving, it was massive. I thought it was a rock at first, and then I realized it's a turtle. So why did it get so big? You know, I asked. And she said, because it's greedy, which in England means gluttonous, eating too much food. And then the other girl that was with her said, I didn't read the sign, I'm not sure. But the first girl didn't. You don't need to read the sign. It's because it's eating too much. That's why it's so big. So this is would be an example of kind of ultimately landing on negative learning because of the child kind of trying to construct their own answers for what's going on. But it's completely unsurprising from a kind of Vygotsky perspective. You have resources at hand. In this case, in her life, the way that people get large is by eating too much. And so this was an explanation she already had to hand, and she applied it to this new unfamiliar context. And so this came up a number of times, also in explanations for why gorillas are so hairy. It's because they don't shave enough. In a way, it's true. So these kinds of inferences were much more likely when the child was unsupported. So my conclusion was that there needed to be more support, more and better conceptual resources provided for these kinds of experiences. So next thing I'd like to talk about is negative learning, as well as the pattern I found of children expressing ethical concern about animals being held in captivity, which was not anticipated by the zoo for some reason. They didn't expect there to be either of these things. So this is just my visual aid for the concept of negative learning from a visit to Wien Zoo very recently, where the sea lion is dancing with the trainer. So they didn't do anything quite this bad in London Zoo, but they did for their program where they kind of got into a car, and then they drove out to schools. They called them outreach programs, where they took some animals with them, a snake, a ferret, and a macaw, which is a large parrot. They took them out to a state school, and they went in, they gave their educational presentation, they got the animals out, they showed them to them. In those, there were much more likely to be kind of unnatural animal behaviors. Again, not as bad as dancing with the sea lion, but still somewhat unnatural. So I found quite a lot of negative learning impacts from this particular type of educational intervention. In fact, I found more negative learning impacts, more children had negative learning than had positive from this program that the zoo was running. And it was this kind of thing. So beforehand, this child has a pretty good sense. They're asked, again, same questions. They're asked to draw an animal in its wild habitat. And beforehand, the child's done a pretty good job. It says monkeys, tropical birds, rainforest. So that's a pretty good one before. Then after the visit, they've had these animals come into their classroom, this kind of setting that they know very well, and this seemed to disrupt their sense of connection between wild habitats and animals. And they're much more likely to see this kind of flat, no background kind of representation. And this is a ferret, so I included a picture here. And during the presentations, they would kind of put biscuits out on the floor so the ferret would go around and eat them, and they could see the ferret walking around. And that's what's represented there in that drawing. So that's what stuck with the child. And similarly, I found when they used the macaw, they had the macaw wave with its claw and say, "Hello." And this fact is what stuck with some of the children. When I asked what they remembered from the presentation, what they learned, they said, "I didn't know that parrots could talk. This is amazing." And that they could wave. So there were clear patterns of negative impacts from these kinds of artificial animal behaviors. One thing that I found particularly interesting in terms of ethical concern was that there seems to be a kind of base level of ethical concern about zoos in the broader population of London school children, which is not something that's actually known or established in research at all. But in the pre-visit measure, when they were asked to draw an animal, a fair number of them did this kind of representation of a kind of jail-like setting. And They also, in the thought listing measure, when they're asked what came to mind when they think of zoos, 10% of them wrote something related to cages, so that was the thing that they associated with zoos, not animals, but cages. And sometimes worse words than cages, like torturing animals, cruelty, words like this. So there was a surprisingly high level of kind of negative representations of zoos in the kind of population that arrived at the zoo. And there's no reason to think that this is an unusual population. The children themselves don't make the decision about whether to go or not to the zoo. It's a school level program, so they're just kind of dragged along. So this is probably quite representative of the London school children population. What was somewhat surprising is the drastic decline in ethical concern from pre-visit to post-visit, from 365 instances beforehand to 32 afterwards. And so it seems that the kind of understanding and representation of zoos in that population was a lot worse than the reality they encountered in the zoo or other aspects of the experience, like actually seeing live animals overwhelm those previous ethical concerns. But that was quite an interesting finding. And again, there was a clear pattern of they were much more likely to decline in concern if they had a presentation from the zoo staff. Much more likely to stay the same if they went around just with their teachers. So here's an example of this decline in ethical concern. From pre-visit, it says tiger in a cage is their pre-visit representation, and then post-visit they're showing a gorilla in a more naturalistic setting. Okay, so that's learning at the zoo. Quick tour. Comments, questions?
I have a comment and a question at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
I'm really amazed by your work. It's really interesting. And I work in a totally different area, but with children, on the citizenship and basically how kids and adolescents become part of something wider. And what I'm interested in your work is if students somehow start to feel themselves as part of this, like nature or wildlife, or how you call it.
Yeah.
Or still this division between we humans and you animals, right? So how can you make them all? Do you have any ideas or results on that?
There have been some studies looking at that in adults, not in children, but they used kind of concentric circles and nature itself, and they looked at whether there's any shift. And they found that the zoo experience did bring those things a little bit closer, not much closer, but a little closer. But overall, I think zoos are an instantiation of what the kind of the general way that modern societies think of and deal with animals, which is seeing them as a kind of resource to be managed. And so overall, I think it reinforces the kind of Enlightenment notion of humans are here to dominate and control nature for our own benefits and purposes. And so there's a kind of conflict between the kind of structure of, here are our animals that we're looking after, and the kind of what should be a kind of more progressive notion of, we're all part of nature, and we need to kind of recognize that and live more sustainably. I think there are a number of kind of conflicting messages that are appearing for the children, and overall the presentations, the way that the education happens in these settings, isn't reinforcing the idea of similarity so much. And when they do, it's a tricky. One of the tricky issues in this area is anthropomorphism, representations of animals as if they were humans, and like you see in Disney all the time, that kind of thing. It's a kind of ubiquitous part of culture, and it's quite problematic if you want to have an accurate understanding of animals to project human characteristics on them. On the other hand, it also helps for kind of persuading people to care about them. So it's kind of an unresolved dilemma in this area of conservation education, to how to deal with the kind of noble, savage animal kind of concept, or the we're close and all part of the same. It's an interesting challenge. I think the methodology would apply to measuring children's responses to messages about citizenship.
Sure. Use the same methodology.
I've used it in quite a range of settings. From quite recently, I did a couple of studies on how children responded to messages about the kind of the ancient Roman heritage in Britain, as well as the Viking heritage in Britain.
In museums?
It was partially museum, partially kind of an NGO that was based out of Cambridge University that was running this program. The part of the session was in the British Museum. Yeah, it's worked very well in quite a diverse range of contexts.
I was very interested in that, in how it transfers to other areas. Well, wonderful, by the way, really interesting. And maybe it's a different methodology that we usually use, when we come from education or psychology. And I love the finding about, I don't know if it was part of your study or just a reaction that the museum staff had, to find out that when children were learning, they were more satisfied. It's like grown-ups tend to believe that children don't enjoy learning.
It's not just children. The zoo has this view about everyone, that nobody wants learning.
Yeah, it happens to me too. Like I work with preschoolers and I work in vocabulary teaching. And when you tell the teachers to teach vocabulary words when they're reading books, they're like, oh no, the kids are going to get bored. And I'm like, who assumes that people are going to get bored when they're not understanding their story versus...
Yeah.
So that, and teachers hold these beliefs. It's really
it's
scary.
hard. Yeah, it was a bit scary, to be honest, spending time watching the teachers operate.
Parents.
Well, in this case it was teachers, but I'm sure parents would be just as bad or worse. But teachers, you kind of expect more. They've been trained. They've had, they should know some decent theory. But what I found was they were extremely reluctant to admit they didn't know things. So instead, they would just make it up. I had a number of cases where I interviewed different children from the same class who witnessed the same kind of events. And they all asked like different teachers or support about what had happened, and they'd all been told different incorrect answers about what had happened. And so the best behavior I saw from a teacher was when a child asked her a question, she took the child over to the sign, the informational signage, and showed the child how to use the informational signage as a source of information. Because it's such an opportunity. It's an amazing thing when you see children here too. I saw in South America, I've seen the same thing. When the children arrive at the zoo, they see a live animal and they start peppering their teacher with questions. Like it just spontaneous questioning emerges. It's such an opportunity for learning because they're so kind of eager to understand at that particular moment, that it's such a shame to watch it being completely wasted.
Wasted opportunities.
Yeah, that's the summary of most of my work, actually.
And I was going to ask you, how do you think, you said you had some experience at the British Museum, and also you talked about art galleries at the beginning. I was wondering how it transfers to other domains. I think all learning should be like this. But how do you? So you said you did something similar at the British Museum, and so you find the potential for learning is similar. Do kids do that asking questions too with the mummies or with the animals or with the paintings?
They do. It's not as pronounced with objects, but interesting objects have the same potential for kind of spontaneous questioning and for kind of arousing curiosity in the children. But I've never seen it as strong as in zoos with live animals. It's quite a remarkable opportunity.
I have a question, really interesting about your work, and it's related to a saying that, actually it's a quote that I heard, and I will rely on your Spanish.
Okay,
Actually, I don't know how to translate it in English. It says, people, la gente, no cuida lo que no conoce y no cuida lo que no valora lo que no conoce y no conoce lo que no se le enseña.
See, and I've heard this before.
Yeah.
It's a kind of refrain in conservation education and the kind of broader field of conservation.
Yeah,
Y
yeah.
creo que no está mal.
Well, so my question goes
Yeah.
in that direction. In that direction, we can actually learn something, have some conceptual change. You might have like declarative knowledge more than before.
Mhm.
So my question is, does this translate into behavior? There's some research in that.
Sí, buena pregunta y es muy importante. Es eso que esto. So there's been a lot of discussion and debate about this in the field of conservation. And I actually just this morning finished editing a paper that's going to be going in on this topic from a global survey that we did of people's understanding of biodiversity and their reported behaviors relating to biodiversity. We analyzed the link between those two things. So they were asked to define biodiversity. What is it? ¿Qué significa biodiversidad? Y cuáles acciones puede hacer para ayudar a conservación. Y haces estas acciones los tres variables. And we found that there is a statistically significant relationship between knowledge and knowledge of specific behaviors, and then knowledge of specific behaviors and reported action, but it's not a very strong relationship. It only explains 2.4% of variance. The effect size is only 2.4% of variance explained. So there are many, many other factors other than knowledge that are important. And one of the factors actually we found was, this was a study done all over the world in 33 zoos and aquariums all around the world, people coming into them. And one of the statistically significant factors that was just as strong as knowledge was a cultural one of which part of the world you happen to be from. And South America was a statistically significant predictor of lower levels of knowledge and action relating to biodiversity, and also Asia. So, as well as membership in environmental group, and there are a range of other factors, whether you watch television shows. So knowledge is just one piece of a much more complex puzzle. But this kind of naive notion that that it's a direct line. Knowledge, you have to know in order to value. You have to value, and then behavior. This is actually the explicit model of the kind of change model of a number of major conservation organizations in the world, and it's obviously wrong based on existing research on the relationship between attitudes and behavior, as well as this more recent study done. So this is something I'm targeting in my papers recently.
Well, so can I follow
Yeah.
up that maybe there's the link between know and
Mm-hmm.
to actual behavior maybe is not strong.
Mhm.
Maybe the link between valorar, to value something,
Sí.
and to behave in the same direction to value is maybe there is some relation.
Yeah,
Would
it's
be
stronger.
surprising that it's
No.
not.
Yeah, there is a relationship, but again, it only explains a part of the behavior. So there's a lot. The place where most of this research has been done is around the relationship between kind of intentions relating to voting and values relating to voting behavior, and then whether people actually vote for that person. And it's quite an imperfect relationship, but that's an easier link to make between values and voting than the idea of, I think it's important for the environment to be safe, but that means I'm going to have to actually change my life. I'm going to have to actually stop doing things that I want to do and start doing things I maybe don't want to do, pay more for electricity. There's a whole range of things that it's a lot harder link to make than the link to voting. So I think there's reason to think it's more complex. So one of the arguments I've made is that there's a tendency to kind of see the problem in neoliberal terms as a problem of individual choice and individual behavior, that you need to persuade the individual in order to get the individual to change their behavior. I think it's better to see it as a social change problem, that the structure of modern societies is inherently problematic in generating these problems. And so if you only target your interventions at the individual level, then you can have a lot of success at the individual level while the world goes into, into decline around you because the structures are still all in place. So I've advocated more work around targeting legislation and lobbying government and these kinds of more structural things.
Revolution.
Sí.
The green revolution.
Necesitamos revolución.
According to your results, learning at the SUR depends heavily on the sessions of the systems at the SUR. So, and I was wondering if this is really a universal kind of session, and I doubt it. So my question is, do you have characterization of these sessions? I mean, how much instruction such people have, and how long was the duration of the tour and so on?
Yeah, they were different. So the sessions were not all the same, and I did some statistical analysis to see if there were differences across individual types of sessions, and there weren't. There were pretty similar patterns across the different sessions. They all hit on similar points about the relationship between animals and their wild habitats, and then different kinds of conservation messages about, it's good to recycle, or different things. But overall, they provided enough conceptual resources to benefit the students' experiences. So I think that's the universal point, is that providing conceptual resources that help you make sense of an unfamiliar setting is an inherently beneficial thing for learning. And that, I think, would apply to a university setting just as much as a zoo setting. And and the question of whether it's a universal kind of session, these kinds of educational presentations. I've met zoo educators from all over the world now, and they like to borrow from other zoos' practices. So they are remarkably similar. The practices of zoos all around the world, in Japan, Europe, here in South America. It's unusual when I encounter something different. In Argentina, at one of the zoos, I encountered something different. They were particularly keen on critical pedagogy at a particular zoo, and so they had some unusually good ideas about what to do. But other than that, it's remarkably similar.
I think a good question would be, why are zoo educators so different from school educators?
Mm-hmm.
Because I've seen people at museums in general, science museums, and even other kinds, I've seen people, young kids or even teachers that have gone into that area do things that I never see at school.
They're very engaged in some way.
Yeah, and they make these conceptual links. I feel that that's more likely to happen
I don't know if it's something inherent in the individual or where the individual works. I think it might be just that they're specialized in.
Yes, I think, yeah, because this is specific, and whereas the fourth grade science teacher has to go from light to boa.
Sure. Exactly.
Yeah.
So they're going to know.
Yeah.
They're going to know very little about the specific in any one area. So one of the recommendations I made to London Zoo was that they start a program where they bring teachers in and they basically make them better able to interpret the zoo experience. Because I think with a day of training, the teacher probably could be much better at it. And that would be a kind of efficient option and might benefit them more generally. I don't think they haven't fully done that, but they have done some teacher training. So.
Okay, first, it's just amazing what we have saw here. I think everybody here is pretty amazed. In order to continue with the line about the conservation and all about that, I think the knowledge, it's not just the thing that makes people want to conserve things. I think in the zoo, what we have is the proximity between the animal and people. Because if somebody knows about something and values it, I don't think he just wants to conserve it. Because he may have an idea that that's not really good. If I have the proximity and I have something, kind of a feeling for the animals, then in order to have them with me, I just have to conserve them. So then I think that would be the...
Estoy de acuerdo, es una oportunidad en ese sentido, pero también es posible impacto negativo porque me gusta este animal, entonces quiero para mí, en mi casa. So it doesn't have to be, like, again, it's a kind of, what I kept finding in the zoo setting is there are a series of kind of opportunities where the child decides like, oh, I really, really like this animal. And if at that moment you provide the kind of bridge to a conservation idea, it's likely to stick because you know that you want to connect that to that kind of immediate experience. But if you don't, if it's just the child walking around and they see, oh, qué linda, and they move on, it might have no benefit at all in terms of anything bigger.
Of course, I think it's one of your conclusions.
Yeah.
There must be something, some people try to guide them, and also it's a whole conclusion. Yeah.
No, actually, this is exactly what I was going to ask, because I studied in moral development theories and competence, and one of the main things that they talk about the moral development is that it's important to have like a dilemma situation, where they have like confrontation with old ideas and new ideas, and then following guided reflection. So people cannot like, oh, a dilemma, and like, and go home.
Yeah.
And have to have a guidance.
Yeah.
And to like lead the way or to support some conclusion.
Yeah.
And I was going to ask if you saw some like effects of maybe professor discourse about conserving or ethical dilemmas, because as you begin the speech, like the ethical worries are the most important thing right now we should be looking at, right? Because of animals dying. So like the professors, when they make a certain speech or like really emphasize the worries about ethical problems with the children, do they actually like talk back? Do they have worries also?
There tends not to be much open discussion. It tends to be, even in like in all of the cases, there's a very hierarchical structure, both between the educators, the teachers, and with the zoo educators. It's kind of question and answer in this kind of hierarchical structure, not a kind of equal, let's talk about our concerns kind of discussion. And that's actually part of why I saw some promise in this tema zoo in Argentina, because they were thinking of it in more progressive, critical pedagogy, more equal kinds of terms, and that was their kind of starting point, so their plans were better than I'm used to seeing. So yeah, I didn't see much of that kind of, the children having an opportunity to air their concerns and discuss, and it was much more closed.
Since you have done research on zoos and archives, museums in other contexts, do you think there's something specific to animals as compared to like art or animated objects?
I do, yeah, it does, the patterns are different. And actually they're stronger. So the potential for impact, I think, is a lot stronger. There's something about live animals that really grabs their attention, the children's attention, and creates this kind of opportunity, this curiosity that it does happen in other settings. When a child sees something, let's say like a Viking helmet or something, there's a similar kind of opportunity. But there's something about the kind of strength of the emotional appeal, the kind of immediacy of it, of the experience of animals, especially if they touch the animals, that had a remarkably large
It's
impact.
more sensitive to say.
It makes a big difference, yeah.
But touching in the classroom or touching in the environment?
Well, also in the classroom, the only animal they touched when they went out to the classroom, the outreach visits, the only one they touched was Charlie the cockroach. They had many cockroaches, they're all called Charlie. And that did stick with them. They did remember in the sessions where they touched the cockroach, it did stick with them. It was just, the zoo has some additional advantages because they create a kind of setting that mimics the natural environment often, the better zoos do. And that helps quite a bit actually. In other research I've done in other kinds of setting, other zoo settings, I found it made a big difference, kind of clearing out the artificial kind of aspects of like the concrete, that kind of thing, and replacing it with more natural looking vegetation, that kind of thing. It improved the learning impact, it provides kind of cues for connecting the animal to the correct kind of habitat.
Bien, junto con agradecer a Eric, quiero hacerles una invitación o un recuerdo si es que no han recibido la invitación. Mañana viernes, mañana viernes a las 10 tendremos una conversación con Eric en un contexto un poco más informal. En principio está pensado para la gente de los 2 doctorados, pero obviamente todos los que están aquí sentados por alguna razón vienen acá, siéntanse convidados, por favor. Es una conversación que más bien va a ser aprovechar un poco la experiencia que tiene Eric en investigación. De paso, algo que no les comenté, Eric hace los cursos de investigación en el Departamento de Sociología de su universidad y hace tanto métodos cualitativos como cuantitativos. Por lo tanto, es una buena aproximación, digamos, para las personas que están pensando en sus diseños. En fin, él tiene la experiencia, digamos, en su propia investigación. Por lo tanto, siéntanse invitados mañana a las 10 en algún lugar.
Sala 1 o 2 norte del doctorado, que es el segundo piso por allá.
Dicho eso, quiero leer un aplauso a Eric.
Y puedo enviarlo artículos, si quieres. Tengo 2 artículos en español y muchos en inglés.
Why did the turtle grow so much? What was the answer?
Genetics.
Because it's green.